Yeah, I got sucked into the family business, is the way I say it. You know, I was off doing my own thing. I loved the computer engineering and the computer science world and the teaching and all of that. And actually, it was my brother who asked me to join the company, the family business, to automate it, because they were growing so quickly, and so I agreed to come in for a year, and that's turned into 32. So yeah, and I think part of that was the growing up with Chuck, you know, and having him in the family, being a part of his family. He was always working. He was always busy. He was up in LA. He still had his house up in the Hollywood Hills, producing cartoons in Hollywood, and even after Warner Brothers and whatnot, which we get a little bit of history. Seems appropriate for the Costa Mesa Historical Society that I talk a little bit about history. When I was asked to speak, it was kind of like, well, what do I talk about? You know, and I got a little pushback on concise when I walked in. Somebody was like, really? You're going to keep it concise? And I said, yes, you have 3 minutes to have the entire life of Chuck Jones. Okay, not 3 minutes, but maybe 53 minutes, because we'll have a little Q&A, and I know we have to get out of here at some point. But, you know, as we kind of take a look at the history of Chuck Jones, what we're going to see is that what I'm going to talk about is actually, oh, please, there it is, a very concise history of Chuck Jones, okay? So the basics, if it's very concise, there you go. He was born on September 21st, 1912, and passed away on February 22nd, 2002, which everybody thought, you know, timing is his key, so it's 2/22/02, so it's just, you know, perfect. But as, I guess, became so famous over the last few decades, it's the dash. It's what goes on in between. And so to give a little perspective of what it is, you know, I thought I'd start with what do people mostly remember. Bob was very good at seeing whether or not you're familiar with that. But perhaps a great way is to kind of remind you of, you know, sort of the lineage of Chuck, what people mostly remember. And as this happens, take a look and keep track of the years as they go by. It's pretty quick, so let's take a look. Whew. Anybody else tired? Think about that. He has over 300 films in a 70-year career. He could never stop. So, yet, outside of all of the animation and the animated films that he made during that time, there's so much more to put it all in context. So, hey, look at that. That's Chuck. His parents, my great-grandmother, Mabel Martin Jones, and Charles Adams Jones, you know, bouncing baby in 1912. So he had 3 siblings, two sisters and a brother, and kind of put it in perspective of what was going on at the time that he was born. You know, right before then, first airplane flight. Right after he's born, women get the right to vote. First radio. So it kind of, World War I is within that time frame. Encompassing his life are some pretty dramatic things. But it kind of puts it in perspective in the last 110 years, where since he was born, the way that the world has evolved. And what I like to look at is what was going on in the world, in the country, in the film industry while Chuck was creating these cartoons. And what was he doing during this time? So that kind of gives you that broad stroke of him passing away just after the last dash over there in 2002. So one of the things that really Chuck talked about and that impacted him a lot was his love for drawing and reading. And so I said there are 4 kids in the family, and they're all voracious readers and artists. They all went into an artistic industry, became artists, graphic artists, but Chuck and his family moved around Hollywood. He was born in Spokane, Washington. He talked about being run out on a railroad rail when he was 2, so he was just kicked out basically. But his dad traveled around a lot. Let's meet his brother Dick.
Chuck's talent was beginning to show at a very early age. He was really quite a good draftsman as a youngster.
We did move around a lot, and the way we moved was that my father would look around till he rented the house that had books in it.
Not just books, but good books. Full sets of Mark Twain, full sets of Dickens, Baudelaire, O. Henry, de Maupassant. And we had read every single one of those, all of us, and we ended up with a pretty good knowledge of world literature.
So that was Richard, Uncle Richard, and his younger brother. And but what he didn't say was, and Chuck used to talk about, that their father insisted that they bring something to read to the breakfast table because he was insistent that nothing intelligent was ever said at the breakfast table. So you couldn't speak, so you had to bring, if you wanted to do anything, you had to bring something to read. But about that same time, they were encouraged by their mother to draw. And it was an insistence on an opportunity as well, because his father, Charles, was a serial entrepreneur. You know what a serial entrepreneur is? A failure again and again and again and again, yes. But he never gave up, at least not that I know of. But so every time that he would start a new business, and he was a very well-read, eloquent, intelligent man with brilliant ideas. And so, but when he started a business, he would publish beautiful stock of stationery with the name of the business on it. And he would have Ticonderoga pencils with the name of the business on it. And so as they would come into fruition, and then they would inevitably very quickly die, you'd be left with reams of great paper and all these pencils. And so the encouragement was to draw to use up all the paper and the pencils as quickly as possible, as the next ones were going to pile up, because he didn't want to store all that stuff. And so, and he insisted that you only draw on one side of the paper. His father said that, imagine, if Da Vinci, had the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper on the same canvas. I mean, how would you display it? So one side of the paper used up, all the paper as quickly as possible. But, as they were growing up, Chuck taught himself how to read so that he had something to do at the breakfast table at the age of 3, about the same time that he started to draw. And as he got into school, he had this incredible vocabulary, and he had this incredible knowledge. His father would, he'd kind of, as he said in one of his books, Chuck said he didn't understand all the vocabulary that his father was using, but it was like dancing along, picking and seeing what you could, understand, even when he was 4, 5, 6 years old, and the parents never talked down to them. They talked to them as adults and just let them learn in context. And so they always spoke about what was current events and, kind of disappointment with the current politicians and the way the policies were. But with all of this, as he got into school, he was quite a ways ahead of a lot of the other students in a lot of ways. And so I think with the art and the reading and the encouragement to think differently by mostly his mother, he didn't like school very much. But also, this is the time that the Stanford 9 tests. How many people know of the Stanford 9 tests? They're developed back in the teens, I guess. Maybe it was in the 20s, to test all of California for the kids, so that it would establish where they are. They still have the Stanford 9 tests, and that it establishes whether you're in sort of an advanced program or you need special help to get to the average or whatever it is. But back then, they decided that the way to do it was to test people, figure out where they should be. Chuck being, let's say, in 3rd grade, tested at a 5th grade level, so let's put him into 5th grade. So they moved the kids all around to the level where they were doing, so the teachers only had to teach one level. But all of a sudden, imagine, a 10-year-old kind of hanging out with 12 and 13-year-olds, not so fun any other way than maybe academically, but it wasn't even that fun for him at that. So some of the personifications that he created during his career discussed that a little bit. I guess, Chuck, the imagination of from A to Z that he would get in school, he would daydream. He really hated the way that the classroom was being taught as a rote. 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 4 is 8, 8 + 8 is 16. And he talked about how he hated the way that everybody was being taught exactly the same. And so by the time he was 15, he was miserable in school. And he talked about that his father took pity on him and put him into Chouinard Art Institute, which was the premier new West Coast art institute here in Los Angeles. And so at the age of 15, he went to Chouinard and, as he said, took pity on him and put him in there. Actually, one of his sisters was put in there as well, into the traditional fine art drawing program. And it was a 3-year program. And there's Chuck, 3rd from the left, with some of his contemporaries. But the contemporaries at that time are artists like Millard Sheets and others that were there. There were great Disney background artists that were at Chouinard at the time. And so he went through this 3-year program at Chouinard, learning the classical art. And oh, there he is. So I don't want to get ahead of myself, but he dreamt of being a fine artist. That's what he wanted to do. That was his idea of what was next. And he talked about his, and he said that if you didn't think like this, that you shouldn't be a fine artist, that his dream was to, when he graduated, is to move to Paris and draw beautiful women on the Champs-Élysées. And as he said, die at a ripe old age of 37, right? And he references like a male Camille sort of thing. But when he graduated from Chenard, it was 1929, right when the Depression hit. And so, and he said, you have to die poor, you have to get there. And so you have to survive, until you do that. And so he needed a job. And so he worked on Olvera Street, which is still up there in Los Angeles, as he said, a tourist trap that, had trinkets and whatnot. And he did caricatures, as he said, for $1. Why anybody would pay him $1 for a caricature, but he was pretty good at it by that point. And he was a pretty darn good draftsperson by then. And he worked in a puppet shop, painting puppets. I don't know if he actually did puppeteering. Did he do puppeteering?
Not that I know.
Yeah, but he obviously painted puppets, because here's a photograph of him painting a puppet. Yes, but and then obviously he loved to draw, but then he said that he answered an ad as a cell washer. Now, he joked that he thought he was going to work in a prison, but actually what the job was, that he would go into an animation studio. In this case, it was Ub Iwerks studio, which was an offshoot of the Disney studio. Ub Iwerks and Walt Disney created Mickey Mouse together, as well as Oswald the Rabbit in the offshoot at Ub Iwerks Studios. And Chuck went in and was a cell washer to begin with. And so he was paid to wash the paint and the ink off the cells, because it was cheaper to pay him next to nothing to reuse the cell, where you put the animation on and then lay it over a background and take a picture of it to go into the film, which is either a 12th or a 24th of a second, each one of those cells. But then he would wash them off and they would reuse them, and that's how they would make the films. And then he made his way through Ub Iwerks into an assistant animator position. So he was doing Flip the Frog, but he met someone else. This is my grandmother, Dorothy Webster Jones, Mom's mom. She was basically running Ub Iwerks Studio, and as the administration. And so she had they had met, and she had the opportunity to fire Chuck twice. First time didn't stick; he did come back, but the second time, from what I understand, he did actually get fired. But he ended up marrying her, and as he was in the middle of the Depression, he's looking for another job, and he joined Leon Schlesinger Studios, who was under contract with Warner Brothers at the time to create these Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons. And so here's one of the things in the museum archives that shows that that they are signed on for another, what does it say, 6 months? For a season. So imagine that you have an entire studio wondering who you're going to make cartoons for the next year. And so that's what Chuck signed on for in about 1933. And again, moved up through the ranks. The gentleman in the middle, Chuck is over on the right behind Bob Clampett. In the middle, that's Tex Avery. And Tex Avery was really Chuck's hero in the animation world. He was the one who said that, Chuck said that he taught Chuck how to direct. Chuck animated for Tex. He really learned how to time films from Tex. And so now we're looking at, this kind of era right here in the early 1930s, and Chuck's starting to do some Porky Pig cartoons and animate those for Tex, and working alongside Bob Clampett and doing some of those projects. But if you think about, what's going on here, the Depression is still going on. The first talking pictures are in the late 20s. We have yet to hit the World War yet, but there are things going on in Europe. And Chuck, in 1937, has my mother. And that was a great thing for me, being in the future. Yes, thank you, Mother. I would give her a round of applause just how cute she is, for gosh sakes. I mean, but Linda and Chuck in both, and then a painting. You were about 5? Yeah. About 5 years old, the Chuck painting that Chuck did of Linda at that time. But 1937, Linda is born. And also, kind of put a little reference going on, 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Late December, that's their first feature-length film. So you can kind of imagine, Disney Studios started in the 20s, but the feature, as they built up, didn't happen until 1937. And this is actually the same time, one, that my mother was born in July that year, but also Chuck starts to direct that year. So he'd already been in the studio for 4 years, being an in-betweener and an animator, but got promoted in 1937 to becoming a director. And at Warner Brothers, a director was the king of the fiefdom. I mean, there were usually 3 units that were creating these short subject cartoons, and short subjects were what Warner Brothers were known for. They didn't do feature-length films in animation. They did feature-length films in live action, but back then you had to have a cartoon going out to the theaters along with newsreels, and it had to be an entire show. And so back with Leon Schlesinger Studios, the discipline was that the theaters would not take less than 6 minutes because they needed an entire show. They needed to entertain. If it was going to be a double feature, whatever it was, they needed to fill. There was a reason to come in. There was no television. Yes, radio was there, but all of a sudden these talking pictures were going on, and cartoons, a brand new medium. Think about, technology. Only in the 20s that animation really started. I mean, the first actual cartoon that was done, at least domestically, in 1914 was Gertie the Dinosaur. And that was done by a guy named Winsor McKay, who had drawn every single image, including the backgrounds of a dinosaur named Gertie, that interacted with him in a theater. And there was no dialogue to it. They played music live, and he would interact to it. So it was only, a couple of decades since the invention of this entire art form to when Chuck was starting to create and direct these cartoons. So The Night Watchman was his first cartoon. It debuted in 1938. And you think, okay, well, he started in 1937. Why is it released in 1938? Well, all right, I'll ask, except for you two in the back who cheat. How long do you think it takes to create a 6-minute cartoon back in the days of Warner Brothers? From beginning to end? 9 months. God, you're good. A little giveaway from 37 to 38, but well done. Anywhere between 6 to 9 months. She brought them. Now, you win a prize just because that's, see, participation is everything. I don't know. I like that. Lisa's my production manager back there, which is why I'm here, because she knows Barbara. And, we've been working together for about, 30 years? Oh, yeah, okay, shh, can't be that long, yes. But, yes, it takes about between 6 and 9 months, depending on how complex it is to make one of these cartoons. And it is there's roughly 5,000 drawings that are created for a 6-minute cartoon the way that Chuck did it. When you're animating on either 2s, which is 12 frames per second, or really it's shown at 24 frames per second, think about how much work there is to do one individual drawing and then put the animation together and then make sure that it's transferred properly to the cells by professional inkers and then painted on the backside by professional painters and then laid over the backgrounds that are all designed by the art director and the background artists. And after 6 to 9 months, you would have an individual 6-minute cartoon by that unit. And there were 3 units that were working. But again, if you think about and you look at how many cartoons that Chuck produced in each one of those years during that, staccato presentation, how on earth, if it takes 6 to 9 months to do an individual cartoon, could they release 8 to 10 a year? And back, it must have been, when 30, 40 years ago, I remember hearing Chuck talk about that Disney was the Cadillac of the industry, and they were the Model T. That was sort of what they felt like. But after he died, I read a book on Ford, and it finally occurred to me that it wasn't the quality, it was the method. Disney created productions that took 2 or 3 years, and he would start, and then it would produce, and then it would release. Thank goodness that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs did very well, because it funded the rest of the whole studio, and it allowed them to grow and do more projects. Whereas, like a Cadillac, were handmade. The Model T was a production line process. Very inexpensive, had to be on time, on budget, and it went through a production line. And everybody did a little something. So these cartoons were made in a production line process where the director and the writer would get together for 5 weeks and talk about story. And then the story would go to dialogue and sound. And the entire, when it went into layout, Chuck would, for 5 weeks, do about 400 or 500 drawings to determine exactly what the cartoon was going to look like, down to a 1/12 of a second of that film. And then he would pass it off to the animators, and animators for 5 weeks would animate. And so they would always be moving forward, and as it got through, it finally would get shot, and then it would potentially sit on the shelf for months or even a year or more, because they never knew what film it was going to go out with. Their job was to produce the films, but they never knew exactly when they were going to get released. They would get finished, and if you don't know if something's going to get released, the discipline is that you can't use any topical humor. Because what was funny 2 years ago is old hat now. So the discipline for them was to create things that were funny forever. Timeless, exactly. So for them, that was their discipline. How do you make something entertaining and funny that will last forever? And it turns out that after 80, 90 years, they're still appreciated as funny. So this is a original model sheet from the Night Watchman. And the story goes that this little guy has to take over for his father. He's a cat that is taking over for his father who's sick. And the mice gang up on him, and he's just sort of the victim of the whole thing. Then finally gets his courage and ends up beating up all of the mice and taking back control of the kitchen. But it was, you see the characters very round and very slow. If you watch the cartoon, it's sort of very Disney-esque back then. And people accused him, you were ripping off Disney. And he said, well, we were all sharing what we were doing because it was a fledgling industry. And of course, who are you going to learn from? The guys who have been doing it. And so, as he evolved through time, then he evolved his cartoons as well. Now we fast forward to 1939, and Chuck is at a ripe age of 26, and he's already directed, a dozen films by this time. And so, as we enter the war in 1941, he is at Warner Brothers, is tasked with creating training films for the Army. So under contract, Leon Schlesinger Studios was producing Snafu cartoons. Private Snafu. I think everybody knows what the Fouled Up is all about. But he worked with some guy who was in the Army named Ted Geisel. Anybody know who Ted Geisel is? Dr. Seuss. So Ted, before any of the Dr. Seuss started to come up, was a captain in the Army, and he created the character conceptually, and Chuck did the drawings to create the character of Snafu. And together they created the stories to train servicemen, mostly, in counter-espionage, in malaria training. And they had all of these documentary-style pieces of animation that were then shown to the servicemen to train them on this. Because they found out that if you put actors in these roles of the live-action cartoons, the servicemen wouldn't watch because they knew they were actors. And if you put servicemen in the films, they can't act, so they'd laugh at them as well. So instead, you create something that is funny, it'll pay attention, and the information will sink in. So Private Snafu and the Army training films are born. God, we just moved all the way to 1940. See, I told you it was concise. I'm passing so many things. But that is a touch point for the history that he met and worked with Ted Geisel back in the war. So now we go all the way to, and again, every year, 8 to 10 cartoons are coming out of the studio. But in 1949, 3 major achievements. The first one is the first Roadrunner and Coyote cartoon, someone's favorite in the room, I think I remember. Fast and Furious debuts. And so, and it was only until I thought they were created in 1948, 1949. Turns out that in one of the archives that my mother has and has gone through, that there is some letters going back between Chuck and a friend talking in 1947 that they were actually playing with these new characters. And so the idea of Roadrunner and Coyote came up 1949 or 1947 because they were looking for a chase. And the Keystone Cops were chasing, Tom and Jerry's were already out there, they were chasing. And so he and Mike Maltese, who was one of his primary writers, Ted Pearson, another great one that he worked with, were imagining what animals, because people chasing people, it's not so fun. I mean, the Keystone Cops, that's live action, they're going to do that. But he would go out to Arizona to square dance with my grandmother. They would go out there, and they had friends in Arizona, they'd go square dancing, and they'd watch the Roadrunners chase each other all over, up and down the sorrel cactuses. Don't know if you know it, but Roadrunners are incredibly territorial. They protect about an acre of land, and any other Roadrunner comes on, they got to chase them off. So they're chasing each other all over the place. But Mike and Chuck decided that 2 Roadrunners chasing each other wouldn't be that interesting. So, but Chuck was all about character. And if you read things or even watch his cartoons, his character development is acknowledged as unique and different than many other people's character development. That his Bugs Bunny is different than Friz Freeling's Bugs Bunny, is different than Bob Clampett's Bugs Bunny, is different than Bob McKimson's Bugs Bunny. His was more debonair, articulate, intelligent, had more quips, was always more confident, wasn't that crazy, wascally, insane rabbit that Tex Avery had named Bugs Bunny in 1940. But his evolved differently. But Chuck went back into his memory, turns out, this voracious readership that he and his family had, going house to house, reading Twain and Baudelaire and O. Henry, came to bear in 1947 as they imagined what they were going to do, that there was a book that he read at the age of 7. So 30 years before, he read a book, and he'd read it a number of times, but Twain was going across in a stagecoach with his brother and had never seen a coyote. And he wrote in Roughing It about a third of the way through. And if you take a look at this, it's the coyote, and I want you to imagine Wile E. Coyote as Chuck reads this and how it could, so the coyote is a long, slim, sick, and sorry-looking skeleton with a gray wolf skin stretched over it. A tolerably bushy tail that forever sags down with a despairing expression of forsakenness and misery a furtive and evil eye, and a long, sharp face with slightly lifted lip and exposed teeth. Is that not just exactly what it is? Yeah. He's the allegory of want. I mean, as each one of these sees, he's always poor, out of luck, and friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even fleas would desert him for a velocipede. And as I read this for the first time, that it just became so clear as to how Chuck's mind works, that all of this sits in there, and that he would pull that out and go, well, by the way, here's what the Roadrunner and Coyote is going to look like. The first drawings of what his interpretation of the first Roadrunner and the first Wile E. Coyote would look like. And so if you think about what was written by Twain, it's perfection, but it's Chuck's hand. Twain couldn't draw that. He wasn't an artist. But Twain was really Chuck's hero, but in so many ways. Now, actually had the privilege of speaking with Ken Burns, the documentarian, just about 2 weeks ago. He was on a speaking engagement, and he and Chuck were very good friends, and my mother and Ken are still good friends, and he was in town, and we went to sit with him, and he made the observation that that Twain died in 1910. Chuck was born in 1912. He goes, if Twain came back in anybody, it would have been Chuck, because he now took it to the next level of that. So that's Ken Burns talking. I thought that was just brilliant. So the next documentary in 2060 by Ken Burns has, yes, no, it doesn't. He is booked 10 years out. So anyway, but it kind of gives you a little emphasis or a little insight into how some of these characters, because Chuck always said the characters came from within of him. You know, where do you get Bugs Bunny in the way it is? Each of the characters is in him in some way. But also in 1949, his films won 2 Academy Awards. It's pretty cool. I mean, that doesn't happen very often. It's the first 2 films that Chuck did. For Sentimental Reasons was the best short subject animated film. And So Much for So Little was the short subject documentary, which is a brilliant film on acknowledging exactly why you want to pay your taxes, because you get so much in return. It's about 27 minutes of great animation, and the films won 2 Academy Awards, presented in 1950. And here is my mother and my grandmother and Chuck with the Academy Awards. And that actually looks like he's actually happy. There's a few others that he's not so happy, or he looks a little, and the reason that he's not happy, he got to have the Academy Awards for a day. Because back then, the directors, even though they were the ones who were everything on the film, came up with the ideas, came up with the animation, timed the whole thing out, did all of the work. Back then, the Academy designated that the producer had to take the best home. So Eddie Seltzer, who had no knowledge of animation, took all the Academy Awards home. And still to this day, from what I understand, they sit on some grandson's mantle somewhere. And so he got access and to take pictures of them for one day. So a little bit of a disappointment. But what the heck, it was, my mother looks good with the Oscars, I think. So there you go. All right. So that was 1949. So that was a pretty big year. But then, you know, we look at what's kind of going on. Television's coming, you know, the World War is over. Korea's kind of creeping up out there. I always thought this was good. I mean, right around that same time, you know, the invention of the Frisbee. I mean, come on. And Mr. Potato Head. Yeah. And the hula hoop. You know. Yeah. So, you know, it kind of puts it in perspective of how the world is evolving. And so, 1950, the 50s, people refer to as the golden age of animation. Now, you know, Chuck was asked, what does it feel like to be in the golden age of animation? And I heard him say it a number of times. He goes, you never know when you're in the golden age of animation or the golden age of anything. You just do your best, and people then look back and go, wow, that was a pretty spectacular time. But the golden age of animation, of Chuck Jones. So in the late 90s, historian Jerry Beck, he's still regarded as probably the greatest animation historian out there. He teaches at Cal Arts, which grew up out of Chouinard Art Institute, as a matter of fact, back in the 60s. But he did a poll to 1,000 animation professionals, the best, and so you're talking 1,000, and they got to rank the best short subject cartoons ever made. So this is the 1990s. So you've now got 65 to 70 years of short subject to gauge, and they could pick anything they wanted. It's 24 or 5 minutes of animation or less, and so and he ranked then the top 50 cartoons. So Chuck ended up with, you'll see some of these, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 out of the 50 were Chuck's cartoons, including, ranked in order, number 1, number 2, number 4, and number 5. So 4 out of the 5 top, including number 1 and number 2, history has said that Chuck's cartoons were the greatest in history, which is kind of an amazing thing compared to all the Disney shorts, all the Hanna-Barbera shorts, all the MGM shorts, all of that Chuck's cartoons, and he was the first one to say it wasn't just him by any means. In fact, he'd put all of the credit to others. His writers were great, his animators were great. And he said one of his best, if not his best attribute, his talent, was to find people who were better at doing what they did than he could ever be, and keep them close. And my mother tells the story, and Chuck used to tell the story, that he would keep his team very close. He would keep his writers. They would play on the weekends. They would get together and have dinner, and all. They would go on vacations together, so that he knew these people. Think about 30 years creating. He was directing at Warner Brothers, and this is the end of that era. So they were pretty good at what they did, for sure. But around that time in the 50s as well, he, back in the probably 40s is what I've kind of figured, that he started going back to Chouinard Art Institute at night with Don Graham, a life drawing teacher there, who was known legendary in the industry, doing life drawing, really honing his skills. And his art, some of these things are from Chouinard. I mean, these things were done at Chouinard with live models. And so, but he started to get recognition that his were really something quite special. And so exhibitions started throughout Los Angeles in different galleries. And this is the house on Terreco in Hollywood Hills that I actually used to visit, and that he had until the 90s. And so, but this all started at the same time that was going on with this sort of golden age. And in the 60s, we're fast forward, television takes over. Wow, that's a big jump. As television takes over, Warner Brothers decides that no longer do they need to have 6-minute cartoons for the theaters. The theatrical owners, theater owners aren't demanding it, and so they shut down the studio after creating about 1,000 cartoons out of the studio over 30 years. But Chuck's not done. Some of the guys retired. Hanna-Barbera over at MGM had gone off to do television. But Chuck Jones Film Productions. Within a few years, he takes over animation at MGM because Hanna-Barbera had left. He starts doing Tom and Jerry's. He starts doing little interstitials with commercials and whatnot. But in 1965, he creates from a Norton Juster book called The Dot and the Line. And he now gets nominated for his 9th Academy Award. Now we jump back to World War II when he met Ted Geisel. And he's now looking for television productions. He's done theatricals with Tom and Jerry. He's won the Academy Award. But television is really dominating, and he needs to find a production. And he has this vision. 1957, the How the Grinch Stole Christmas book came out, and he was looking for stories, and he thought, I could see how this could become a great television special. And so he went down to La Jolla and made the pitch to Ted that here's the way we would make it, and Ted said no. And so he put together a proposal and went back down to Ted and said, no, this is going to be really something. And Ted said no. And because he had a really bad experience. Ted had a really bad experience with television back in the 50s and just said, my books are my books, and I'm not going to do any more television. And so, but Chuck then really put together, and he put 400 or 500 storyboard. You can see some of them, they're all color proposals and the storyboards down there. And he said, and he put together the whole project and said, this is going to be beyond your wildest dreams as far as the quality of what animation on television could be. And so, he knew that Boris Karloff had to do the voice. He knew that he needed to pull back his great animators like Ben Wasserman, Ken Harris, and Lloyd Vaughn, and Maurice Noble doing backgrounds. I mean, this is 60s. They've all gone off to either retire or working at other jobs. Some of them were animating for him, but they were, for these short subjects, very expensive compared to television. The average budget for a television production, like a Flintstones or something else, was about $20,000 or $25,000 for a half-an-hour television special. And that's how you needed to go out and get a sponsor. You needed to find somebody to produce it beforehand. You don't just sell it to the studio. You had to get a sponsor, bring the money in. And Chuck proposed a half an hour, 23 minutes of animation at $366,000. Think about that. That's 15 times as much. And he went to Roger Mayer, who was, the producer at MGM at the time. Roger Mayer being MGM, and Roger said, "That's silly, Chuck. No one will ever give you that money." And Chuck said, "Don't worry about it. I'll find the money." And so he took those storyboards and started around the country. And he went to the Post, people, and they're like, no. And he went to New York, and they said no. And he made 25 presentations with these storyboards, acting out the story, showing how it's going to be, the quality, Albert Haig was going to do the arrangement. Boris Karloff was the most famous voice in the world at that point. Lived in London. We're going to bring him over, and he's going to voice the Grinch. We're going to have a full orchestra playing. We're going to, the whole thing. And finally, in Chicago, on the 26th presentation, he makes a presentation to the Association of Community Banks in Chicago. And they said, yeah, we like it. And Chuck always thought that was sort of ironic, that the Association of Community Banks would fund the production that at the end talks about, Christmas has nothing to do with presents and gifts. It has so much more, that the banks really wouldn't be on board to tell that story. But they said, yes, Chuck, we'll do it. And I always knew that story, but about a year and a half ago, I was going through the archives of clippings, and there was an article that I'd seen with Chuck's face on it, sort of because during the production, Ted was really not involved much. Chuck came up with the green color for the Grinch in the book. He was a black and white character. He evolved Max, the reindeer dog. And if you look at Cindy Lou Who, she was a little tiny bug in the book, and Chuck created this whole blue eye and blonde hair. And so Maurice Noble did all of the color design for the production. And it wasn't until they had many of the scenes already animated in pencil, and Ted came up and saw the pencil test for the first time, and it rolls on the animatic or on the Moviola, and Ted got done and waiting for Ted, and Ted goes, "Chuck, that doesn't look like my Grinch. That looks like you." And so if you look at the difference between the book, it had kind of a sallow, thin Grinch, a little bit bigger body, to what is there with that wide face and the wide smile and that iconic thing that we all picture is that Grinch Stole Christmas face. That then, when they were marketing it, Chuck would do the Grinch grin in front of Ted, and Ted would sort of look at him in the articles, and they use that for marketing. But I always saw that, but then I read the whole article in the LA Times, and it said that at $366,000, it was the most expensive television production ever created. Not just animated, any production. And that Chuck referenced that it was more expensive per minute than the bridge over the River Kwai that had just been bought by CBS as well. So quality, quality, quality was promised and delivered. And to this day, it continues to show all the time. People would watch it year by year. But that was a big thing. Chuck's 53 years old, and now he's got the Academy Award that he actually gets to keep. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, Horton Hears a Who. He does a feature-length film called The Phantom Tollbooth when he was at MGM as well, his only feature-length film. Beautiful animation, some of the great things. And then into the 70s, I'm just skipping, and kind of moving forward. Bob, I'm going to be on time, I swear. He does television specials with some Kipling classics, The Cricket in Times Square, a few sequels, Raggedy Ann and Andy. He creates the character Raggedy Arthur. That was Chuck's creation. The White Seal. I think Rikki Tikki Tawi was first, and then the White Seal, and then Mowgli's Brothers. And even in the 70s, I was fascinated with Chuck's attention to detail. And I read things, heard things about how he studied in order to create these cartoons. And so back in the 70s, there wasn't high speed, you couldn't take your iPhone and do a slow-mo on a snake or a mongoose and whatnot. But he found some footage at 10,000 frames per minute, I believe. So it's really fast photography. And what it showed is that, because I don't know if anybody knows this, the mongoose always wins. The mongoose kills the snake, but it's a battle. And so he found out that you get the mongoose, and as the mongoose is going, the cobra is going to strike, and the naked eye you can't see this, but the cobra actually recoils the most tiny little bit before it strikes, which gives the mongoose an opportunity to understand here's what's coming and get out of the way and to adjust. Those little nuances Chuck used in the cartoon, the motion, the way that they moved and whatnot. Now, when he went to the White Seal, no less, did he not do, he always did his research. And I still remember my brother and I went with my grandmother and Chuck down to SeaWorld in San Diego. And I must have been 10 or 11 years old. And we went to all the shows. We went to the Shamu show and the dolphin shows and all that kind of stuff. But Chuck wasn't with us that whole day. He had gotten permission to go behind the scenes and sketch in his sketchbook and really memorize how the animals and the fish moved. And so he sketched and he learned and he studied so that they would be realistic. And he said they don't have to be necessarily realistic, but they have to be believable for sure. But he wanted to understand the physiology of it. And when he was at Chenard, you talk about the physiology, the bone structure of a human, so that you get it right. It's got to be correct. And so there's a difference between a seal, this says the white seal, but it's actually the white seal is a sea lion. Two very different animals. One is kind of laid out prone. The seal lays out prone and kind of just sort of blobs along, and a sea lion actually has their knees tucked up. So when they move, they're on their knees and they're hopping. And so, like every mammal, the skeleton is exactly the same. They're just different sizes. Every mammal has the exact same bone structure for pretty much, but the size of the tibia and the fibula and it is different. And so what he discovered is that a sea lion has very similar posture to a human, on your knees and whatnot. And so he theorized that if you constrained a human the same way that the blubber constrained a sea lion, that a human would have to learn how to adapt, to survive, would have to swim the same way. And so Chuck was great at theory, but he also liked to test it. And so he invited my brother and me down to his house in Corona del Mar. They had a pool. And so he stood us up. He put fins on us, on our hands as well. He tied us at the ankles, the knees, and the elbows with rope and threw us in the pool. So imagine a 10 and 12-year-old getting thrown into the pool with just that on. And fortunately, we were reasonable swimmers. We didn't die. The Child Protective Services were not called, thank goodness. And he sat and he sketched that sort of thing, and he was right. So people ask, what was it like to grow up with Chuck as a grandfather? That's a good way to remember. Just saw life a little differently. Most of us survived. So he also did a little research on Mowgli's brothers, and I call it Mowgli's brothers because anybody remember the Jungle Book from Disney? Yeah. How do they pronounce his name? Mowgli, exactly. So Chuck always, when he read it in the Kipling classics, he always pronounced it in his head Mowgli. And he was just like, Disney, why do you call it Mowgli? So he actually called Rudyard Kipling's granddaughter in England and asked, how is it pronounced? Is it Mowgli or Mowgli? And she, in this older vernacular, and she goes, it's Mowgli. I hate Walter Disney. And it is on record that Disney encouraged them not to read the stories. He wanted to do something different. He used the characters, but he didn't want them to utilize Kipling's details. Chuck personified. He loved reading these books and bringing them to life in the way that he saw them. So that's the 70s. The 80s, Mom's back. So good. And his accolades as an artist are really becoming, she started the business Linda Jones Enterprises in 1977 because someone wanted some of the artwork that was used to create the cartoons. And so a lady out of Iowa, and she came to Chuck, the studio, hey, I'm looking for some things that were used in the films. And Chuck said, well, my daughter, who does special projects, you go talk to her. So Linda, my mother, got tasked with going and finding that stuff, and she went to Warner Brothers, and they had shut the studio down, obviously, in the early 60s. And she went to Warner Brothers and said, where's all that stuff? Because people are really interested in it, and I will take care of it. And then she finally found out that in the 66, 67 timeframe that the Warner Brothers needed storage for the publicity department. And so there was a warehouse, a vault with all of those, byproducts from 1,000 cartoons, cells and backgrounds and drawings and whatnot. And so they took them out into the parking lot and they burned them all because they needed storage space. Now, the things that still exist are the things that were either given away to friends who visited the studio, that maybe the people that were involved in the studio took some things home, just a few things that they thought were cool. Chuck did keep some things that he thought were pretty interesting that he created in his direction. But pretty much all of the cells and all of the production drawings were taken out. There was an archivist who was petrified or mortified that this was happening and got permission from a mid-level manager that he could take some of it and donate it secretly to the USC Film School. And so as the story goes, and I've heard it from an archivist who heard it from the mouth of the guy who was there, that the archivist and a couple people took a bunch of the backgrounds, these beautiful hand-painted backgrounds, and hid in the basement while they took all this stuff out. And then they donated it secretly to USC, and it still exists in their collection. As a matter of fact, when we put together a Smithsonian tour in around 2013 to 2017, they loaned us for the tour with the Smithsonian and the Museum of Moving Image and the Academy of Motion Pictures to tour some of these backgrounds. I'd never seen them before in my life, and they are gorgeous. But, you know, my mother finds out that they're destroyed. She's, I'm sure, rocked by the history of it, and comes back to Chuck and is not really looking forward to telling him about this, that they had destroyed this history, and he didn't bat an eye. He said, okay, well, I'm still here. I tell you what, let's do this. I will draw the characters in scenes that I think are interesting. You publish them in the same, you know, with cell and background, the way that they were. We'll do limited editions, like Rembrandt etchings were done, and we'll start something new. And we'll do it because I'm still here. And so they started in the 70s, this limited edition signed industry that still is, you know, going on today. Disney jumped in with signed stuff. Other studios jumped in with signed stuff. But really, my mother, Linda Jones Enterprises, started that whole industry. And so Chuck's fame, people ask, well, what was it like growing up with someone famous? Like, he wasn't famous. He was just Chuck. And I always called him Chuck because he didn't like Grandpa. So he just, you know, we all called him Chuck. When I had kids, he did agree to be, you know, Grandpa Chuck. And he said, I guess I'll be a great grandpa as long as you put a comma after the great. So, which, okay, that's fair enough. So, yeah. But you can see, I mean, he it was a traditional fine artist. Continued that throughout his life with watercolors and oil paintings and drawing and you name it, he was passionate about it. So in the 80s, really and he was represented all over the world in art galleries and is still represented all over the world in art galleries. Even though he's been gone for 21 years, his artwork is still being shown. He's had retrospectives at the MoMA in New York, in Museum of Moving Image in London. We did the Smithsonian. He's been, you know, his history is acknowledged as something unique, even in the animation world. And so we get into the 90s, and my mother becomes a producer on Stay Tuned, the animation segment for Joe Dante and Chuck were great friends. There's an animation segment in there, and my mother produced that short segment of about 4 or 5 minutes of animation. Chuck was brought in as the director and character designer, and they produced this for Joe Dante's film. Pam Dauber and, yeah, I'll come back. Yeah, he's right there. John Ritter, thank you. And then Chris Columbus, who also was a good friend of Chuck's, came to him for Mrs. Doubtfire, and they opened the film with a piece of animation that Robin Williams is supposedly voice recording to it, and that's the way that you come into the film is through this piece of animation. So my mother produced that as well, and that was great. They all connected. They were already friends with Robin Williams, but working with Robin, they all became very, very close. And so, but then, you know, this is 20th Century Fox. That's Morgan Creek Productions. And Warner Brothers is like, what's Chuck doing somewhere else? And so they went and tapped on my mother's shoulder and Chuck's shoulder and said, you shouldn't be doing this. And he said, well, I want to create. And they said, okay, we'll start Chuck Jones Film Productions for you. And so they did, with my mother producing again, 6 short subject films, got young animators together sort of to try to recreate that environment that was at Warner Brothers early on with 20-somethings who had some freedom to create fun things. And after 4 years, 5 years, something like that, Warner Brothers, in their wisdom, decided that they were going to shut it down again. So, yeah, they just couldn't figure out how to get them out because they were theatrical shorts, and they did go out, but they put them out with odd films. But, you know, adults want to see cartoons to be a little happier before they go see Death and Destruction in the theater. Come on. But also in the late 90s, the Academy Awards decided that Chuck deserved a Lifetime Achievement Award, and deservedly so. They don't give away very many of them. I mean, Charlie Chaplin got one, and there a few. But he asked Robin Williams to present his at the 1996 Academy Awards. 2001, he did his last project. It was the only online project. Some of the guys from Chuck Jones Film Productions did an online Timberwolf. It was a project that Chuck had envisioned decades before, that he's a wolf in the forest, and that every time he says his name inadvertently, because his name is Timber, a tree falls on him. Now there's the premise. Now what do? That's the way that Chuck works. So he had quite the life, both as a life and as a producer, as a writer, as a philosopher, as a speaker. I toured with him for a number of years when he would go out and speak, and the accolades and the stories that would come up, the way that he would, you know, speak to people, whether it was 18,000 at the Hollywood Bowl or in a small group in a studio at Industrial Light and Magic up at Skywalker Ranch or something with George or Steven Spielberg. So there was a lot in that time frame for sure. But the human side, I think, is probably the one part that continues. And that people love the product that he created. But when you get to know him, hear who he was, the way he approached life, that's what seems to perpetuate. And so he just, over 70 years, he couldn't stop. He couldn't, if I remember right, a couple weeks before he died, my mother went down and said, "How are you today?" And he goes, "Well, I can't read, and I can't draw, and I don't see the point." And it wasn't very long after that he died. So, but the one thing that I've heard from so many people, including Ken Burns and so many others in the industry and outside the industry, that he mentored, he always said yes when somebody asked for his time or access to him. John Lasseter, in his first year at Cal Arts, went with a group of people to a studio to sit with him and learn about animation, and they give credit to those moments on continuing to perpetuate all of that. Chuck said, you know, that the greatest killer of creativity is the word no. And so he was all about that golden yes. And so the idea that that continues, and it was the whole inspiration behind the foundation of the Chuck Jones Center for Creativity, was how to perpetuate and create some way that we can encourage and inspire people to find that creative genius that exists in each one of us in a unique way, and continue to spread that throughout the world. And so we do it here. We've got a center in Chicagoland, in Schaumburg, Illinois, and in Central Florida is starting. We've got the beginnings in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it's been now 24 years, but it continues to propagate. You know, finding these ways to inspire people to think creatively, think differently. So, you know, he continues to inspire through it all. And, you know, I still feel like I work for him every day.